Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week, we'll be discussing the production of Beethoven's opera Fidelio that had actual prisoners singing the prisoners' chorus. Then we'll compare tournament brackets full of canonic composers. And finally, we'll discuss some drama in the classical Grammys. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So Tiffany, what do we have today?
Today, we're playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Viola Hero. In the world of classical music, the viola is often overlooked and maligned, the red-headed stepchild of the string section. With this game, we seek to bring awareness to the irreplaceable value of the viola in well-known orchestral works. Here's how we'll play. I will name a category of symphonic repertoire and then play for you a few bars of just the viola part from a famous work. I have my trusty viola with me, and my co-hosts, along with all of you at home, will try to identify the piece after hearing the excerpt. You guys ready to play?
Yes.
Yeah, let's do this.
Okay, here we go. This is I think for this one will be fairly broad, just because I think that being too specific in the category will give it away. So this is romantic symphonies.
Romantic symphonies. Okay, that's pretty broad, but
I know. It's only because I think that narrowing it down too much will make it too easy.
Yeah, great.
I suspect. Oh no.
Wow, romantic symphonies was...
Should I narrow down the category?
Well, let's think about it for a
No.
second. Hold on. Let's think about it for a second.
Oh, I think I know what it is.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think it's the Scherzo of Dvorak 7.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yep. Good.
Nice. Well done.
All right.
Nice.
Good. I didn't go too broad after all.
Good job.
Okay.
Good job, Kensho.
Thank you.
Okay. Your second category is incidental suites.
Incidental suites. Okay, so we're talking about like music written for usually a play. Yeah, a play. I think we've had this category before. It used to be very common, right? That you would go to the theater, there would be an orchestra there. You go to see some just straight play, not a musical, and there's an orchestra providing underscore. And so that's essentially what this category is. And then sometimes they would insert some bigger pieces of chunks of music in there.
Well, and in the case of suites, like a composer will excerpt the most successful parts of that music and make it into a more well-known concert unit.
Right. And of course, this goes out, having live orchestras in theaters for plays goes out about the time the movie theater comes in. So, this is probably pre-1900 would be my guess.
Here we go.
Oh, got it.
I expected Will to get this one.
Go ahead, Kensho. I have no idea what this is.
Is this Defia, three-corner hat?
Yeah.
Wow.
The very end, right?
Of the danza
the very
finale.
end. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Kensho, amazing.
Yeah,
2 for
I know
2
my
here.
viola.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 for 2. Good. Your final category is Wagner.
Oh,
Just Wagner.
Wagner. Okay.
Just all
right.
Wagner.
So there's approximately 48 hours worth of
Yeah, narrows it down, right?
endless
I really hope this
melody.
is Ride of the Valkyries and just like
Yeah.
just
But I think that we can fairly assume that Tiffany is going to have provided something from one of the more popular orchestral excerpts that appear with frequency on concert programs, rather than some like interior
Some
bit of
corner of
Götterdämmerung.
Rheingold.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, here we go.
Find out.
I have a guess. Kensho, do you have a guess?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Is it Siegfried Ideal?
Yeah. And like this is such a great example of like why playing the viola does not often give you a good idea of what the piece is about. Because like what is happening during
Yeah.
this section? And of course, you're thinking as a conductor and as a musician, frankly, da da ya da da, which is immediately recognizable, but what the heck is this?
Yeah. Right. I mean, you chose something that's actually not from an opera. It's sort of like adjacent to an opera, but it's an independent chamber orchestra
and
work.
I didn't know what to name as the category for this, which is
Right.
why I just went broad.
Yeah, that
So,
was really smart, because
because what other pieces are in this what category is this?
right, yeah, this is a category unto itself, the Siegfried Ideal. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Oh,
All
I'm
right.
so happy that I
3 for
got
3.
one.
Yeah, good. That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment, but before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds, so we invite you to try and stump us. Check out our show notes, where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. I feel like every time I'm inviting people to stump us, like the cachet of that invite gets less and less valuable. All right, and with that, we move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have for us?
Our first topic concerns a radical restaging of Ludwig van Beethoven's opera Fidelio by Hearbeat Opera, one of the U.S.'s most forward-thinking and innovative companies. Hearbeat is known for stripping down operas to their most basic forms and then rebuilding them in totally new ways. In this production of Fidelio, Florestan is now Stan, a Black Lives Matter activist who has been thrown into solitary confinement. His jailer is the corrupt prison governor Pizarro, who quotes former President Donald Trump. Beethoven's Leonora, the woman who loved Florestan and dressed as a man to carry out his daring escape, is now Leah, a genderqueer prison worker. Perhaps the most famous number in Beethoven's one and only opera is the Prisoner's Chorus, a moment when Florestan's fellow inmates get a rare chance to see the sun and breathe the fresh air. And this is also where Hearbeat has made its boldest production decision yet. Singing the Prisoner's Chorus are actual prison inmates, members of prison choir programs throughout the U.S. Let's listen to a clip. According to the NPR story that we will link in the show notes, the goal of the Prisoners and Hearbeat Opera was to cast a light on mass incarceration in the U.S. Does this production accomplish that goal? Well, perhaps that's a good place to start.
Well, Will, as you've written in our notes here, like this is a digital compilation, like pandemic era project. And like so much of the social justice movement that took off after George Floyd's death and Black Lives Matter, it played with the whole dynamic of the pandemic in a pretty unique way. I mean, frankly, a project like this, especially one that branches multiple prisons, is not possible if it weren't for digital compilations, right? Like this is a complete non-starter. You cannot have this. And I will venture to say that it's unlikely that any one chorus is going to be from in a prison is going to be strong enough to really pull this off on their own, right? It was like truly only the pandemic era digital collaboration shape allowed this project to happen. I think that's fairly accurate and fair to say, right?
Yeah, when I saw the headline, my assumption was that there would be prisoners like in person on stage.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
This project, though, was initiated back in 2018. I think it had a premiere, and then there was talk about bringing it back in 2020, and that's when it was interrupted by COVID. So I'm assuming, as you can see in the videos of the prison choruses, they're obviously not masked or anything. So this was all those recordings and stuff like that were done previously, 2018. And but in a way, it's like they were ahead of their time without knowing it, right? Doing these kind of stitched together performances with video and audio even before that was
okay. So I misunderstood the timeline a little bit.
But I mean, the current production is a revival, and it did just play. It played in the month of February. Started at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and then it toured to UC Davis, Scottsdale, Arizona, and Santa Monica. But I think the question still remains, like, when you update a production like this, does this bring something new and particularly relevant? Because I will put my cards on the table and say that I think that this is a great example of a updated production. I can tell that a lot of work and thought went into it, and even into the orchestrations. I mean, they totally redid the orchestration for like 2 pianos, 2 horns, strings, something like this. So I fully acknowledge that there are better and worse contemporary updated productions. In general, I'm not such a fan of resetting operas in other places because I think that the power of these operas, of these period pieces, is that they
speak to their times, right?
But they speak to our time too,
through the lens of their own.
Through the lens of their own time, right? Exactly. And I think that we lose that, when we update it to be like I just don't understand why things can't be left as period pieces and left to speak to us in their own terms. But I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I agree with you for 95% of what you said. The last line is like, I do see why, and that is to try and bring a segment of the population into appreciating this that otherwise would have no desire to. I'm not saying that they have no basis for it, because they do, right? I mean, that's your argument too, which is that like we can always find relevance in these historical pieces that speak to our times through their own. Like we don't have to put Black Lives Matter on top of Fidelio in order to make that at all relevant, because Beethoven did speak to political injustice in his own time in a way that is highly relevant. But some people would otherwise just simply not have the incentive at all to even try. And I do think that that's coming from the thing that is missing in our audience these days, which is just a basic knowledge of the canon. And like when you don't come from that bread and butter knowledge, then like the updated versions both make more and less sense.
Yeah, so I'm kind of consolidating all of our thoughts here by saying, yes, I agree with you, Will. And, also just understanding what Hearbeat opera is. It's not the Met Opera, right? It's trying to be more modern and mobile. And, they're on tour, right? They're going around the country performing this in a way that obviously those bigger institutions can't. So obviously updating it to a point where it's a little bit more accessible, creating some kind of incentive or hook for people our age or younger to be interested in the subject matter and then therefore the music, I think is a really successful way. I mean, it's also, we're taking some levels of abstraction here too, right? I mean, the score has been reduced down to two pianos, 2 cellos, 2 horns, and something else, right? A percussion, something like this. So
percussion, yeah. You could definitely hear marimba, if you listen through later on.
So it's an update of all of the music, basically, right? It's not, and obviously the lyrics and all of this have been also updated to the times. So.
Right, exactly. So they've changed the lyrics, although they still had. I was kind of impressed that these prison choruses were singing in German.
Right.
I was a little bit surprised, quite frankly. And I don't know, maybe because Kensho, I know that you have some contacts at Heartbeat Opera, so maybe you can tell me a little bit more about this. When they update the lyrics, the impression I get is that they're not actually changing the German original, but they're just putting super titles that say something different on top. Is that the correct? Because there are groups that do that.
Perhaps. I'm not sure exactly what they do, but when I read that the Pizarro quotes Trump, I mean, obviously that was not in the original libretto. So.
Because, for example, like that's what the Met did with their famous, what was it, Lounge Lizard Casino version of Rigoletto. Yeah. They just put like, swinging 60s, like, Frank Sinatra, like kind of translations of the Italian, but the singers are still singing the original Italian. Mm-hmm. I mean, where I come down on this is like, I just think if you want to make a new opera, make a new opera,
I was going to say, they should not have called this Fidelio. Like, I mean, if you're going to go so far as to like change the orchestra, I mean, even if you're using, like the least you could do is call it Fidelio Remixed or something like this. Or you could try and be creative in some way and call it like Floyd Delio or something.
But in the end, they are doing the Beethoven music, essentially.
But if you're going, I mean, so then how far is too far? I mean, this is actually a conversation we're going to have later on in our third segment, right? About like what counts as original or not. And I am on the fence about this one. And that's why earlier I mentioned like the general public's lamentable state of knowledge about how our music gets created, because somebody who had never heard of Beethoven, well, not never heard of Beethoven, but never heard of Fidelio prior to watching this, would not necessarily come away with an understanding of what the work itself is. They would be like, oh, have you seen that show? Mm-hmm. It's called Fidelio. And some other person is going to be like, oh, you saw Fidelio, the opera? And they're like, yeah. It's like, no, not really.
Right. And here, this is where I think that there is a distinction to be made from this, which I think is like an authentic attempt to do something like good with this material, versus what's called Regia Theater, which I would call Eurotrash opera stagings, which is all about directors who are just jaded and bored.
They're bored
because they know these operas so well, so they just want to do anything new with it. And their thing is like, well, we've all seen Fidelio 100 times. And it's like, well, actually, no, we haven't all seen Fidelio 100 times.
And in fact, it's still worth doing and doing well, and not like putting in lots of, I'm completely on the same wavelength as you with that.
But just as a composer, my feeling is like, if you want to do a new opera, get new music, like do something new, like create something.
No. It is really interesting, right? I was actually just on their website and I was wondering, like, do they do any new opera? But their mission is literally, Heartbeat Opera creates incisive adaptations and revelatory arrangements of classics, reimagining them for the here and now. So I don't think they've commissioned any new operas, which I find really interesting, that they're really making a conscious choice to be like, okay, we're going to take these classics like Carmen and Nozze di Figaro and Fidelio and just changing it is kind of their mission.
I mean, I think that does provide them with a very identifiable thumbprint in our world. I mean, opera companies are here and there, and they all do commissions sometimes, and they all do new stuff sometimes, and they're all participating in all these trends to some degree. And so I think that's just an effort in making their mission statement very, very clear. And I mean, it helps a lot in board meetings. I'll say that.
Well, very interesting here. Listeners, we'd love to know what you think. Give it a listen and give it a look, because the videos, when you see these prisoners singing these choruses, it's just interesting to see what's going on here. It's also sad, I have to say, like, a lot of these prison choruses like have a lot of old men in there, and you're just like, what are these people doing in prison? I don't know. So maybe this was successful. Like, exactly. It really made me think about it.
I was going to say, we didn't really address your original question, which is does this help or succeed as such a, does it help to bring attention to this idea of this issue of mass incarceration? And I think the answer is yeah. I mean, it's meaningful to put us as a classical genre in touch with actual things that happen on the ground in the world that surrounds us today. I think that is actually a meaningful connection for us working in the field, and I would hope that it brings folks that are working to better those issues a kind of appreciation of how classical music can help and touch that's the spirit of what they are doing, the humanitarian spirit, which is certainly what Beethoven was after, I would think.
Yeah, I thought seeing the people singing in these courses, it really helps humanize them, which is important sometimes. I mean, I hate to say it, but yeah, it was very interesting. So listeners, give this a watch and let us know what you think. All right, with that, on to our next topic. Kensho.
Well, listeners, March Madness is upon us, and as the resident sports ball fan on the GabFest, I thought it'd be fun if we filled out a classical music bracket on this segment. Will has created a canonic composers bracket for all of us to complete, which we will link in the show notes. So all three of us have filled out our brackets here. We're going to compare our notes here. So should we start with just who we have as the winner, like the overall winner, and then kind of work back?
I think that's a good idea. Yeah, because we've got 32 composers here.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a little tedious to go through every matchup, but I'm sure some of them are pretty interesting.
I mean, some of them. So it's interesting. Will tell us a little bit about how you made this bracket, because it's also kind of interesting how the pairings were made, right?
Right. So I'll just say, like, I thought that I had seen these classical music brackets in the past, and I went hunting for one for us to use, and I couldn't find one, so I had to make my own. And I started by using this site where it lets you, do a tournament bracket with any number of tournament competitors. And Kensho, is it 32 teams in the March Madness? I mean, that was just sort of a guess. It's 64. Okay, so
it's actually like 60. I think it's like 68 or something now.
Okay,
they have
this
these
is
weird
already more information than I ever wanted to know.
No, but you need to know this stuff. It's important.
Is the opposite of important. Anyway, so I use this site where you can populate one of these tournament brackets, and then it will randomize it for you. And that is, I think, one of the most interesting things about this. So I chose 32 canonic composers, and let me just get it out of the way. We all believe in expanding the canon. We all believe in expanding our programming. But for the purposes of this, because it would give us more to talk about and compare like to like in terms of our familiarity with the composers, this is the canon. This is, in the words of an expression that I just found out, which I love, this canon is pale, male, and stale. It's all dead old white men composers. Okay, so
I love that.
Next year in March, maybe we'll do an all non-canonic composers thing.
PMS.
We'll do hail, female,
Yeah.
and
We'll come back to you on that one.
yeah, we'll.
So anyway, yeah. So that's how I made this. But listeners,
So which pale, male, stale composer won for you, Will?
Beethoven. I mean, it was so predictable. It's like no matter what the matchup is, you're gonna end up with your favorite composer at the end. What about you?
Yeah. I got Ravel, actually.
Oh,
which
interesting.
Totally makes sense for me, I guess.
What about you, Tiff?
Who do you think?
I think you did Brahms, probably.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so what were your guys' final matchups?
My final was Prokofiev Brahms.
Oh my gosh, interesting. My final was Beethoven Brahms. Mm-hmm. And I it's so tempting to choose Brahms, of course, but like, I had to honor my 13-year-old self, in choosing this.
There's so much of so the question that I used, which if I tweaked my question a little bit different, then I would end up with a different result, right? Like, whose music do I want to sit down and listen to right this instant? Mm-hmm. That's where I went, and that's why in my semifinal, Prokofiev won out over Debussy. I mean, no one is going to argue that Prokofiev was kind of more instrumental to the musical modernism in a way than Debussy was, and like Debussy was a giant in the changing of tonality and had so many landmark things attached to him. I'm not arguing that. I just like, if you put a gun to my head and say, well, pick a symphony, or not symphony, but pick a piece, I'd go Prokofiev.
Wow, interesting. So, but Kensho, what was your final matchup?
I had Sibelius and Ravel, actually.
Oh, wow, interesting. Sibelius got pretty far on mine. I mean, you guys are gonna make so much fun of me. I had Sibelius beating Verdi and then beat Prokofiev in the Sibelius-Prokofiev matchup. And then, who do you think that I had Sibelius pitted
Bernstein.
against? No, I didn't. You would think so.
Really?
Yeah.
You didn't have Bernstein in your final four, Will?
No, I didn't. I had Vivaldi.
Wait,
what?
So Bernstein didn't even make it past round 2?
No, Bernstein beat Rossini in round 1, and then Vivaldi.
I think
beat
that
him.
pocket square that you stole needs to be.
To be returned to the Bernstein estate?
Yeah.
No way, never.
Yeah.
But no, then Vivaldi beat Sibelius for me. I don't know. It's just, and that was really hard. That was really, really hard. and then I had Beethoven beating Vivaldi.
Okay, hold on. Sell me on Vivaldi getting so far for you, because I don't know. I for me it was such an easy Berlioz in that first round.
You chose Berlioz. Interesting.
Vivaldi has the most. I mean, you listen to like Baroque instrumental writing, and I think Vivaldi has by far the most expanded color palette of folks who try to kind of carry a sense of verve and excitement in their music. I mean, I think Vivaldi is king at this, and he does it. I mean, he does it like a machine, which is why so much of it is like, makes it into Suzuki books at some point. But for ability to represent, I think he takes it. I mean, Berlioz, I listen to every other work, I'm just mystified. I'm just confused.
I mean, Berlioz is a weird composer, and actually that's why I like him a lot.
Yeah.
If in a different matchup, Berlioz would have won. I mean, I think Berlioz is great. But I just love Vivaldi's verve. I just love the brightness. Actually, I mean, Tiffany, it's interesting that you use the word that he's like a colorist, because I actually think that Bach is like a much more interesting colorist of instrumental writing of the Baroque. But for Vivaldi, I just love, he brings so much joy and like effervescence and rhythm, and like rocking out. That's what I like about Vivaldi.
If you're talking about Bach and colorist, I mean, I do agree that Bach used a wider range of colors in terms of instruments and dug deeper into like the inherent qualities of those instruments. But within, let's say, the violin or even the string orchestra, I don't think Vivaldi has any rival in the Baroque era in terms of ability to achieve like range of representation and colors through that group.
So here's a question for both of you. Speaking of Bach, so, I mean, Bach is like the Shakespeare of classical music, right? How far did he make it in your guys' brackets? Because with mine, I had him beating, so it was a Bach-Mozart was the first round, and I chose Bach there. And then my second round pitted Bach against Debussy. I chose Debussy over Schumann. And then I had Debussy beating Bach.
That's exactly what I had.
I mean, the fact that Bach and Mozart were in the first round was already a sort of like, give me a break. Like,
well, who did you pick?
I picked Mozart.
Oh, interesting.
Whose music would I rather listen to right this instant, right now?
Yeah.
Let's talk about those pain points.
Oh yeah.
Because there's some that were kind of tough to kind of navigate in that first round, right?
Yeah.
So like Rachmaninoff Shostakovich even is a little bit like it was a push for
hard.
me.
Who did you guys pick?
And then
Shasti.
I went with Rachmaninoff.
I also went with Rachmaninoff.
I'm such a sucker.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And then for me, the second round in the bottom right-hand corner of Puccini against Brahms was like a tough one for me. I don't know.
What? I had trouble with Puccini Schubert, which was the first round.
Me too.
And I chose Puccini.
Me too.
Okay, interesting. But
I hated Brahms
Puccini?
Dvorak already. I hated Brahms Dvorak already. This is round one.
I think Dvorak would have hated that too.
I mean, and there's an example of where the randomizer actually chose, comparing sort of apples to apples.
Yes.
And that was hard to do. I mean, for me, I think the hardest one in the first round, well, there were some hard ones, but Stravinsky Bartók, that was really hard. And I chose Stravinsky, but I could have chosen Bartók in a different day. What'd you guys pick on that one?
Stravinsky as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that one wasn't as painful for me because, like objectively they rank lower on my totem pole than either Dvorak or Brahms. Like the fact that Dvorak and Brahms were like first rounders, like, give me a break. Like, I'm not even going to give to Antonin one shout out here.
Kensho,
so also
how far
I think I know where you're going with this. So I want to tell you about this. So in every March Madness bracket, definitely every year, but also there are many kind of big time upsets where like the 16 seed beats the 1 seed. I gotta say there was quite an upset here where Haydn beat Bruckner in my bracket in the first round.
Yeah, I mean, Haydn beat Bruckner for me, but that was obvious. I mean, that was like
right.
the gimme
I think
of the
if
whole
people
thing.
were betting on what my bracket would have been, I think that might have been the big surprise there. So yeah, sorry Bruckner, you didn't even make it out of the first round.
Nice. Oh, Kensho, it's great to hear that from you sometimes.
Will, what did you do with Haydn versus Stravinsky?
I picked Stravinsky, but that was hard, Did you have that same matchup?
I went Haydn.
Yeah.
And Kensho, you went Haydn, and what did you do?
Yeah.
I went Haydn too.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so then Ravel beat Haydn for both of you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I had Ravel beating Stravinsky, but that wasn't quite as hard. And then were you guys left with Ravel versus Brahms for the semifinal?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I chose Brahms, and we know who Tiffany chose. Kensho, you chose Ravel.
Yep.
My in the semis, the Brahms versus Mahler was a hard one for me, actually, because I do so love Mahler.
For me, Mahler didn't make it out of the first category.
I know. I knew he wouldn't. I just that was a hard point for me. And Brahms ended up winning the whole tournament, and that was hard for me.
I'm guessing that neither of you chose Purcell over Copeland, as I did.
Who? Well, this was a fun little exercise. Listeners, you can find Will's bracket in the show notes, and let us know who you end up picking.
Yeah, and do fill out your brackets. And we'll have Sunny post them on our Twittergram and whatever.
Oh, for a second, I thought you meant like fill out your actual March Madness brackets. I thought you were advocating for this.
Oh my God, Kensho, what is wrong with you?
Who do you have winning?
What is wrong with you?
You think Duke's gonna win it this year, Will?
It's pronounced Duke.
Oh, excuse me.
Oh my God.
All right, enough of that.
Get me out of here.
We're never going to do any kind of sports-related topic ever again after this.
This was a real gift to you, Kensho. I hope you enjoyed it.
Moving on, Tiffany.
It's time for a special edition into the GabFest's periodic foray into my favorite territory, award shows and competitions. But this time with a special twist. The Grammys, which will be awarded in just a few weeks, has stirred up a debate in the classical world. Two of the nominees, pianist Jon Batiste and violinist Curtis Stewart, present music that, according to musicians who have submitted complaints to the Recording Academy, has been miscategorized, that while the nominees are great artists, they are not producing classical music. Let's hear a clip of the Batiste track that was nominated for Best Contemporary Classical Composition, Movement 11. In an article in The Guardian, composer Mark Nykrug is quoted as saying, "As a serious, dedicated composer of what has always been considered classical music, I am dismayed. I have spent 60 years studying and laboring at this precise craft. It is unfathomable that an organization which is supposed to have some inherent knowledge of music would choose to recategorize an entire segment of our inherited culture." We'll talk about that turn of phrase in just a second. On the other hand, Curtis Stewart, one of the artists in question, who studied at Eastman and has performed as a classical soloist at the Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall, says, "I do not need to justify my music's inclusion in the classical music category, but I hope that it can connect a divide that has hurt and ostracized classical music from a world of listeners for decades. My work attempts to draw question marks to categories. I think of myself as a classical musician." Okay, let's get into it. What a hornet's nest we're going to open up here. So, I think this speaks to some of our observations that we've already made about these nominations, right?
Yeah, that's right. Every time we talk about these awards, all we talk about is how stupid the categories are.
Yes. What about the complaints? I mean, now that we've gotten complaints that kind of like expose the very gaps that we were talking about, but in kind of a specific way, I guess. I don't know. What's the solution here?
I don't know what the solution is, but I mean, I see the justification for these complaints. Like that clip that we just listened to me, does not sound like classical music, and specifically, it sounds like another genre, namely jazz. And I don't quite understand how it got listed in the classical composition category. I mean, here's the thing: it's like we have people arguing on both sides of this, and saying things that like you can always poke holes in it, right? Because I mean, some people are saying like, well, classical composition means that it doesn't have improvisation. And then other people are like, well, okay, go back to Mozart. Like everybody was improvising everything all the time back then. And that is like what we consider classical music. Of course, those improvisations have not come down to us because the classical received tradition is what was written down. And so that sort of has become what we think of as being classical music. But then there's a lot of classical music in the 20th century that would be considered classical that has improvised elements to it. So you can't really make that claim.
Well, even for the jazz and blues idiom that has pervaded our what we call classical music as well, right? I mean, we look at Curtis Stewart's album. The first track is Louisiana Blues Strut, like what I suggested for our classical mixtape from Samuel Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, like
right. Wasn't that the Augustine Hadlick performance of that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's the first track of that album, and that to me is kind of the dichotomy for me. It's like we would consider that classical music, right? I mean, at least I would. And then yet I listened to this John Batiste track, and I can say, like, in isolation, I'd be like, yeah, I don't think that's classical music. But at the same time, what is a difference, right? It's hard to articulate, like, okay, that is jazz-inspired classical music, and this is just strictly jazz.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but I do think that, and maybe, Will, if you are able to drop some of Curtis Stewart, the violinist's album in here, the album is actually compositionally kind of interesting. I mean, it starts with Coleridge Taylor. It has improvisations on Izai. It has a little Bach in there, I think, and then it has several improvisations on like contemporary and, some contemporary pop artists. Whether it gets put in classical category, I think for this one is actually much more debatable than what we just heard from John Batiste, which, I mean, I don't feel like this should be in the classical realm. I mean, I do feel actually different about the two artists. I don't know, I can't really articulate why, just like Kensho said. But I do think that there are fairly strict rules governing what is jazz and blues. And I think that this falls fairly well within that realm. I mean, if I were to do the backwards compatibility experiment, I think that this goes into that category. I don't, and I bet if you asked any of them why it would or wouldn't, they would have just as tough a time articulating as we are having with classical. But what is that? What's the adage? One when you see.
Yeah.
The pornography. The pornography.
Right.
It when you see it.
I know it is when I see it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so look, obviously there's a problem that we're trying to solve here, and it's come up already on this episode, which is that the classical music canon is male, pale, and stale. And we want to get more living artists, more artists of color, more non-male artists. So the Grammys is caught up in this because that's part of the larger industry. And I think that that is a very valuable goal. But isn't this kind of lazy? Going to these artists who are really, at least one of whom, I think the three of us all agree, are really working in a different genre. And just sort of roping them into our genre when there are actually a lot of artists who are not male, pale, and stale who are doing stuff that is classical music and not getting as much attention for it.
Yes.
That you would have to go out and find. And you would have to go out and fund them to make recordings that could be put into nominated for the Grammys, rather than taking these people who already have a much higher profile and just sort of like looping them into our thing when it doesn't really fit, at least in the case of John Batiste,
who has a record 11 nominations.
Yeah,
and just won an Oscar and all this stuff. I mean, but this quote from this composer I've never heard from.
Okay, that's ludicrous. The end of that quote is ludicrous, right? It's like blatant co-opting of the language.
But this is where I read that and I say, it's great that this person is so angry about this, like yelling. I'm sure he's very upset, and I'm just like, you know what? Just for that reaction, I'm totally okay with John Batiste being there. You know what I mean? It's just like, why? Okay, first of all, it's like, why are you gatekeeping in this way? Second of all, like, it's the Grammys, which, again, we've agreed on this show, we don't care about. No one cares.
Nobody in classical music really cares.
So, yell away, Mark. I don't know.
But then my question is also from the other side. Like one of the things that we'll link in our show notes is a thread from Adam Neely, who we've talked about in this show before, who's like a jazz YouTube guy. And he gets all his feathers ruffled, and he's so offended about this. And it's like, why do you care? Like, why do you so want this music to be able to qualify as classical? Like, shouldn't you not give, a shit? Like, I just don't, why are you protesting this so much?
I think it's because of these people like Mark. Again, it's just this kind of, it's so polarized, like with any other discussion.
Right, exactly. It's just somebody makes sort of an obnoxious comment that is gatekeepy, and then it's like, oh no, well, we have to get through this gate. And it's like, well, why do you want to go through that gate? That's what I don't
well
get.
Put.
Now, I guess I'll also mention that friend of the show, former guest John McWhorter, has weighed in on this in his New York Times opinion column. And we'll definitely link that in our show notes. And he comes down, I think, more where I'm coming down, actually, which is that opinion. Like, this sort of offends both genres, and like, just, I mean, look, and we're not saying there can't be crossover, and there can't be like edge cases. And I think Tiffany made a really good argument about the Curtis album. But like, just like, why, like he quotes one of his early music professors saying that, well, Duke Ellington was the first great Black classical composer. And it's like, well, actually, no, he wasn't. He was his own thing, and that should be like loved and respected. And that's where the categorizations get us into trouble in the first place.
I mean, I would love to really enjoy and actually keep up with a classical crossover category. Mm-hmm. Like, that feels like it's vibrant and important and good right now, and I don't see why that doesn't exist. The other thing that I'll say is, I'm glad we have a voice in this conversation represented here on our segment today, John McWhorter, stateside, because I have to say, when I clicked through and like saw The Guardian, and then I was like thinking, okay, British composer who like wants to use language about social justice to pretend like he has an inherited culture that is gatekeeping, like, give me a break, right? But like, The Guardian, in terms of its coverage, and actually a lot of the stuff that we hear from the other side of the Atlantic is quickly sinking to the same tier as like Norman Lebrecht, which, I mean, he's also from that side of the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. It's just like, we're not dealing with the same kind of dialogue. I mean, I'm not claiming that our dialogue here is subtle, but it's more subtle than that.
Do you think a lot of the uproar also is just because these two artists are Black?
Yeah, in both directions, right? Where like, I'm not going to say necessarily that people are protesting their inclusion because they're Black, but that is the read, right? Like, if you're going to have a category full of nominees and then people are going to get their panties in a bunch protesting the inclusion of the one Black artist, then by extension, it just becomes a mechanism of racial exclusion. That is what it is, even though that's not what it was.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that brings me back to my point that, like, okay, so just like, if this is your goal, is to be a more inclusive genre, then find people who are doing this genre, who are the kind of people that you want to include. I mean, that's just what I keep coming back to.
Complex topic, again, easy to ignore, like Will said, but also, speaks to our identity. I mean, we looked at a 2-set video a few months ago. It was like, do they even know what classical music is? Like, we have to ask ourselves this question, right? Do we know what classical music is? And the answer may surprise a lot of us if you're really honest with yourself. So yeah, I'm gonna lobby hard for a classical crossover category. I think that would be really fun, and this is exactly the kind of thing I want to see in it. But that's just me. Let's go to our classical mixtape.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Kensho, what do you have this week?
All right, well, kind of apropos to what we were just talking about, I was just thinking about classical music, things that are influenced by other types of music, and Mason Bates comes to mind. And so I'm suggesting a movement from his piece called B-Sides, and the movement itself is called Warehouse Medicine. And as you know, Mason moonlights as a kind of a DJ of sorts in his spare time. Actually, he really has a career of doing it. And so I was just wondering, like, if this were up for a Grammy in terms of an album or a single or whatever, would there be such an uproar to this? Again, Mason's a white guy. I don't know. I'm just going to pose that question with this track. This particular performance is by the San Francisco Symphony and MTT.
right, Kensho, ever the provocateur. How wonderful. Thank you. All right, Tiffany, I'm so excited. Tell us about your mixtape. This is amazing.
This is the moment that Will's waiting for.
You will be even more excited to know that I think I've been able to finalize as of today that my final show of the semester and the academic year is going to be a Sondheim memorial. So I've been trawling the archives and looking for selections that my group can play, which is a fairly large limiting factor, okay? Because Sondheim stuff is difficult,
right now,
I know.
Way, listeners.
Calm yourself,
we
Will.
haven't said that Tiffany is doing a Sondheim recommendation, and she's gearing up to something. It's so amazing.
So this is one of the little gems that I managed to find that I actually really enjoyed and am happy to recommend today. This is a little song, originally an instrumental actually, called Goodbye for Now. And the link that we're providing in the YouTube is off of a album of unsung Sondheim, which I didn't realize there was any of that, but here is one tiny little, it's like 2.5 minute gem. And I'm just going to read a little excerpt from the explanation here. So it was written for a score for Warren Beatty's 1981 film Reds. And Beatty really liked the tune "The Internationale." It was one of his favorites, and it was apparently one of Stephen Sondheim's least favorite. And then they talked a little bit about whether scores for movies should tell you what to feel. And Sondheim finally said to Beatty, "You don't actually want a score for this film at all. You just want a love theme, right?" And Beatty was like, "Yeah, I guess you're right." So here was the result. It started out as an instrumental version, and then here in the recording that we'll drop here is the vocal version.
Yes, I know. Goodbye for now. How long a year, a day.
All right, well, thank you so much, Tiffany. My coal-like little heart has just expanded 3 times from hearing this. Amazing. All right, so for my mixtape, I'm inspired by Kensho here. I'm going to be a bit of a provocateur myself and do something that I think qualifies in the classical crossover realm. Now that Stephen Sondheim is dead, I was thinking, who would be my favorite contemporary composer? And frankly, I think it is Björk. I adore her music, and a lot of it, Alex Ross has said the same thing, that a lot of it would be indistinguishable from what you might hear on a contemporary electronic music concert. The difference being that most of what you hear on a contemporary new music electronic concert doesn't have a discernible pulse, which I think can be said of actually most of the people who go to attend those concerts as well. But so this is her collaboration with the Brodsky String Quartet, and the song is Bachelorette. And this album, it's like the ne plus ultra. I mean, it's one of my all-time favorites. And I don't know, I think a lot of what Björk has done could be put in the classical music category, but listeners, see what you think. Here's a little bit of this.
I'm a fountain of blood in the shape of a girl. You're the burn and the brim, hypnotized by the world. Dream me, make me feel real. Whacked your beak in the stream, game we're playing is life.
You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. No, like really do it, because no one has rated our podcast for so long. Like, what's going on? We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.